Hello and welcome to Anthropology 1510. Last time we wrapped up the introductory section of the class. We had introduced anthropology, we talked about science and the scientific method in anthropology, and then we talked about culture. So now it's time to start moving into those subfields of anthropology. The first subfield that we'll be covering will be physical anthropology. Now you'll recall that physical anthropology is the study of humans as biological organisms. The different areas of physical anthropology include paleoanthropology, including human evolution, primatology, modern human variation, human genetics, and forensic anthropology. Now overall, physical anthropology is a little more varied than the other subfields of anthropology, and so we'll be spending a little more time on it than we do on the other subfields. So we'd better go ahead and get started. Most of the work that physical anthropologists do is based on the development of evolutionary theory beginning in the late 18th century, coming up into the 19th century. And so that's where we'll start. We'll begin at the beginning. As Europe came out of the Dark Ages and the Renaissance period began, new ways of thinking developed, new technologies developed. Europeans began exploring other parts of the world, seeing new things. Sometimes this period of increased knowledge as new information is coming in is known as the Enlightenment. Well, as we think about the development of evolutionary theory, we need to step back prior to that time and see a shift in worldview from what we'll call the pre-Enlightenment worldview to the Enlightenment worldview. The pre-Enlightenment worldview would be before the development of science and scientific thinking, and the Enlightenment worldview will be as we see scientific thought developing in the beginnings of different areas of science to include evolutionary theory. Now for our purposes, the two fields that are most important, that will contribute most to our understanding of evolutionary theory, will be biology and geology. And so we need to see what the pre-Enlightenment worldview was in terms of biology and what it was in terms of geology, and from there move forward to see how those ideas changed as new information came in, as that scientific method developed. In the area of geology, it was generally believed that the earth was not very old. The Archbishop James Ussher, for example, believed that the earth was created in 4004 BC. And this was biblically based. He took the genealogies in the Bible and worked backwards from known historical events in order to determine this date of 4004 BC. So what this would mean is that the earth would be only about 6,000 years old, which is really not a very long span of time for any kind of change to take place. In the area of biology, there were two prevailing ideas that kind of tied together. The first of these, which was inherited from the Greeks and the Romans, was the concept of essentialism. Now, under the concept of essentialism, it was believed that every living thing had an essence that made it what it was, and that essence went unchanging throughout time. So, cows were cows because they had the essence of cows, and that never changed no matter how much time passed. And the same would be true of horses and pigs and birds and fish, and of course of humans. So everything was created as it was in the beginning, never changed throughout time. The essence remained the same. A second idea related to biology that was inherited from the Greeks and the Romans and then developed further by the Europeans was the great chain of being. Now under this concept, it was believed that you could arrange all living things in a single line from the simplest to the most complex, with no breaks in the chain and no overlaps between the links in the chain. So you would go all the way from the simplest organisms up through the most complex living organisms, which would be humans, and then from that you would go further into the supernatural realm. You would go from humans to the supernatural beings such as angels, and then from that the highest peak, the highest point of the great chain of being would be God, representing divine perfection. An important part of this concept of the great chain of being is that the chain was complete. There were no gaps in the chain. Nothing new was ever added to the chain. Nothing was ever taken away from the chain. It went unchanging throughout time. So as we go through and start to think about changing worldviews, we need to keep this concept in mind, as well as that idea of the Earth only being about 6,000 years old. But as science and the scientific method began to develop, we begin to see a change in worldview as new information came in, as new evidence came in to make people think in different ways. And so we're going to shift from that pre-Enlightenment worldview now into the Enlightenment worldview. As we look at the Enlightenment worldview, there are three basic concepts that we want to keep in mind. The first of these is that they believe the universe was based on impersonal scientific laws. So these laws were set into operation, they were fixed, and they wouldn't be changing on a day-to-day basis. Now they didn't take God out of this. They believed that God was the creator and the master technician of the universe, but he didn't take an active day-to-day role. So he created those scientific laws, he put those scientific laws into operation, but then he stepped back and just let things function. And so they concluded that if the universe is based on these impersonal scientific laws, these laws that wouldn't be changing, then you should be able to use human reasoning power to figure out what these laws were. That human reasoning power was the key to knowledge. While the Enlightenment worldview encompassed all of science as it was known at the time, what is of interest to us, of course, are the changing ideas about geology and about biology. Within the field of geology, there were a number of people that were already starting to observe what was out there in the world, the different geological processes you could observe. But one person that's important to us here is Charles Lyell. And Lyell synthesized a lot of the information that was known, a lot of the things that were understood, in his 3-volume work, The Principles of Geology, that was published in the 1830s. And he proposed the concept known as uniformitarianism. Basically, within this concept, he proposed that the processes that we see in operation today, that is, those geological processes, were in operation in the past. And if we look at these processes today, such as sedimentation and erosion, overall, these processes tend to be very slow, tend to be very gradual. And so his conclusion was that if the processes that we see in operation today were in operation in the past, and if they tend to be very slow and gradual, then when we look at things like canyon walls and see all these different geological layers, you look at the particles in those layers and you can tell what processes were responsible for depositing those. If those processes were slow and gradual, then he didn't know how old the Earth might be, but he concluded that the Earth had to be much older than 6,000 years. It would not have been possible for all those layers to be laid down in such a short time span. Now the significance of that in terms of evolutionary theory is that 6,000 years is not much time as far as biological change goes. Not much biological change could take place. But with the much longer time span that Lyell was proposing, that would allow time for much more biological change to take place. And so that's going to lay the groundwork for the developments in biology that we'll be seeing. The change in worldview with the Enlightenment also affected the field of biology. And as people began to go out and collect scientific evidence, they started to find things that caused them to challenge those previously held beliefs. For example, they found some things that were major challenges to that concept of essentialism, major challenges to the great chain of being. And what might that be? Well, it was the discovery of fossils of extinct species. You recall that within that great chain of being concept, that things went unchanging throughout time. You recall that the chain was complete. It was intact. There were no gaps. Nothing ever disappeared. Nothing was ever added to it. So the question came up, if this was so, then how can we have fossils of extinct species, species that are no longer around? Where did they fit into the chain? So several researchers began trying to figure out where these fossil species fit into the big picture. One of these was Georges Cuvier. And what he proposed was a concept called catastrophism. Within this concept, he suggested that extinctions could occur as a result of natural disasters. So earthquakes and volcanoes, things like that, could wipe out entire species. He further suggested that the areas where these species had been wiped out would then be occupied by other species migrating in. And some of his followers, followers of this concept of catastrophism, suggested that there were new episodes of creation to create new species to fill the gaps that were made by those that had become extinct. But the important thing for us is that for the first time now we have people suggesting that species could disappear in mass extinctions, that something could actually disappear from the face of the planet. Not everyone agreed with Cuvier. For example, Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monet Chevalier de Lamarck, who we'll call Lamarck from this point forward for obvious reasons, suggested another reason, suggested something else that would explain why you have these fossil species that are out there that are now extinct. He called his idea transformational evolution. And what he proposed was going on is that fossil species were actually the ancestors of living species, and that some sort of change, some sort of transformation was taking place over time. He proposed that you had a species A that over time changed into species B, that over time changed into species C, that over time changed into species D, and so on. So you've got a single line of evolution taking place, a single line of transformation taking place. In describing how this process might take place, he proposed two laws. They were very big on law proposing back in those days. The first law was the law of use and disuse. It's a use it or lose it concept. If there is a structure that an organism uses, then it will maintain that structure and it will be developed. If it's something that the organism ceases to use, then it will go away. And the second law is the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now what that would mean is that if an organism develops a characteristic during its lifetime, then it will pass that characteristic on to its offspring. For example, in looking at giraffes, the fossil species, the extinct species of giraffes, have shorter necks, and of course now giraffes have long necks. And so what he suggested was happening was that the giraffes in their environment were having to reach higher to acquire food. And so as their bodies sense the need for a longer neck, these vital fluids within the body would be channeled to the neck, and the neck would actually grow longer during the individual's lifetime. That long neck, in turn, he believed, would be passed down to the offspring. The problem is that this idea is completely wrong. An organism can't develop something in its lifetime that will be passed down to its offspring. That's like saying that if you work out and build up big muscles, then your children will automatically have big muscles. That's not going to happen. Well, not to mention that you're not going to modify skeletal structures of your body like your neck because of a perceived need that your body has. So this is not the way it was working. But Lamarck is still important to us. What we have to understand is that any scientist works from the scientific knowledge base of the time in which he lives, and Lamarck's doing the same thing. Biological inheritance is not understood at the time, and so he's taking what is known and trying to form this concept of transformational evolution to explain how these species may be changing over time. And that's the true key to his importance. He's suggesting that species could change in response to the environment. So for the first time, someone's saying these fossils are the ancestors of living species. They're not just disappearing entirely. They're still here, or their descendants are anyway, but they're changing in response to the environment. If there's one name that's associated more than any other with the theory of evolution, it has to be Charles Darwin. Now, entire courses certainly could be taught on evolutionary theory, and as I learned when I was in England a few years ago, entire courses can be taught on Charles Darwin. I took the train down from London to go to Down Village, where Darwin lived, and went out to visit his house, which is now a national park. And I was on the train with a man who was a professor from New England, and when I asked him what he taught, he said Charles Darwin. I said, oh, I teach Darwin too in my Anthropology 1510 class and my Anthropology 2010 class. What else do you teach? And he said, that's all I teach. I just teach Charles Darwin. So I was amazed to find out that there's someone that studied Darwin exclusively. But unfortunately, even though Darwin is a fascinating man, we don't have a lot of time to spend on any one individual, because this is Anthropology 1510 and we have to hit the high points and move on. But without doubt, Darwin had a greater influence on the field of biology than any other scientist before or since. The concept that Darwin developed is called variational evolution. Now, as we've already seen with Lamar, he wasn't the first person to come up with the concept of evolution, that is, change over time of species. As a matter of fact, Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had written a lengthy poem on evolution sometime before Darwin's birth. But Darwin's going to be the first one to start pulling things together and propose a mechanism by which all this could take place. I do want to give you a little background on Darwin before we continue, just so we understand him a little better. He was born in England, 1809, from a wealthy family, although not the oldest son, which meant that he wouldn't inherit the land. He would have to find a profession. And initially he went to college to study for the priesthood because he thought being a country pastor would be a nice thing. During the week he could go out in the countryside and study insects, which is one of the things that he really enjoyed doing. Unfortunately, he liked to go out and drink and gamble and party with his friends, so his studies didn't go that well. So then he decided that if he wasn't going to be a priest, maybe he could go and be a country doctor. So he went to medical school at the University of Edinburgh. Well, one of the bad things about that is he couldn't stand the sight of blood, and the first time he was in the operating theater, he had to leave. He just couldn't stomach the sight of the operation, operating on this person with no anesthesia. So then he hears from a friend of his that there's a ship that's going to sail around the world, and they're looking for a companion for the captain, a naturalist. And Darwin wants to volunteer, but he goes and asks his father, and his father refuses to give permission. But Darwin continues to pester his father, asking if he can go, and finally his father says, if you can find one sane person that says this is a good idea, then I'll let you go. And Darwin was able to do that. He found a family friend who supported the idea, and so Darwin's father gave him permission to go along on the voyage. And this, of course, is the now famous voyage of the HMS Beagle. They sailed around the world over the span of 5 years, touching base on different continents, on different islands. And as Darwin sailed around the world, he was collecting specimens. He was collecting fossils, he was collecting plant specimens, he was collecting animal specimens, and packaging all these up and shipping them back to England. So many, in fact, that by the time he made it back to England 5 years later, he was already a celebrity. As he traveled around the world, he noted that among living species there was a great amount of variation. He was just amazed by that. And one of the places he noticed the greatest amount of variation was in the Galapagos Islands, just to the west of South America. For example, he noted that there was only one species of finch on the mainland of South America, while on the Galapagos Islands there were 7 species of finches. And as he examined their physical structures, their beaks for example, he noted that the differences between these different species made sense in terms of the environment in which they lived. There was a species that lived on the ground that ate mainly seeds. Well, to have that kind of diet, it would need a heavy beak, and in fact that's what he saw. Meanwhile, there was a tree finch that ate insects and lived in the trees. So what do you need for digging insects out of tree bark? You need a long, straight beak, and that's what this particular species had. There was another tree finch that ate tough foods like tree buds, and so for that you'd need a tough, heavy beak, which is what this species exhibited. And then there was a ground finch species that ate insects off the ground. And of course, as we said with the tree finch that ate insects, one of the things that's beneficial to that species would have a narrow beak so it can reach into holes and grab the insects. So he started to see all this variation that was out there between these different species. And so he started to come up with the idea that what was of importance in terms of evolution was this concept of variation. And this variation was important in a couple of significant ways. the variation between species, that is, species that are very similar to one another otherwise, like these finches, made sense in terms of the environment in which they lived. But as he continued to think about variation, he realized that variation within a species, that is, between different members of the same species, was the key to evolutionary change. And so as he thought about this concept of variation, he started developing his theory of natural selection. And we don't have much time, so we're going to sum it up in 3 principles and 1 driving force. Our first principle is the principle of variation. And what that states is that variation exists. That is, no 2 members of a species are exactly alike in every respect. And in humans, this is even true of identical twins. If you know identical twins, then you know that even though they have the same genetic structure, they are not exactly alike in every respect. So the point here is, variation exists. Our second principle is the principle of heredity, and that simply states that offspring tend to resemble the parents. So the characteristics that parents have, they do pass on to their offspring. There are physical similarities between the parents and the offspring. His third principle is the principle of natural selection. Now, he was already familiar with the way artificial selection worked in terms of agriculture, in terms of livestock. If you want cattle that produce a lot of beef, then you breed cattle that already have a lot of beef. They're large cattle anyway. If you want to breed fast racehorses, you breed 2 racehorses together. You don't just take any 2 horses and breed them and hope that they're going to produce a fast racehorse. So he knew how artificial selection worked. So he thought there must be something working in the environment in the same way. And so he thought that was natural selection. Well, he's already recognized that variation is playing a role here. And he knows that environments are different. And so what he proposes is that there are limited resources in any given environment. And the individuals that possess the characteristics that are best suited to surviving and reproducing in that environment will do so. Those are the traits that will be passed down. So the ones that can best compete for the resources that are available. The driving force, the thing that he thought was pushing all this along, was the struggle for existence, the competition for resources. As you struggle to survive, as you struggle to get food, other members of your species will be left out. They won't be able to reproduce. But if you can survive, if you can get food, if you can reproduce, then you're going to be passing your traits on to your offspring, and those will continue in the species. So when we talk about Darwinian fitness, we hear the expression survival of the fittest. But in Darwinian fitness, it's not just about survival. You have to pass your traits on to the next generation. It's survival and reproduction. If you're surviving, it doesn't matter how long you live, doesn't matter how long you survive, if you're not passing your traits along, then you're not fit in Darwinian terms. Now, the way this would work for Darwin, if we go back to our example of the giraffes, now you recall we said that the earlier species of giraffes, the extinct forms, had shorter necks, and the existing forms had longer necks. Well, what he thought was happening is if you look at the entire population of giraffes at any time, they don't all have equal neck lengths. Some neck lengths will be shorter, some will be longer. So which ones are going to survive and reproduce? Which ones will pass their traits down to the next generation? According to Darwin, it would be the ones that could best compete for the resources that were available. So if a longer neck is more advantageous, so that you can reach up and get the leaves and get more food and have a better chance of reproducing, that's the trait that will be passed down. So it's not that that next generation is all going to have longer necks, but as we go through time, each succeeding generation will have longer necks if that is the trait that is best adapted to that environment. The theory of natural selection made sense to people. They could see how it could work. They could see artificial selection in operation, and they could then understand how that same process could work based on the environment out in nature. What was really controversial that he proposed was the theory of common descent. Now granted, it's still based on his theory of natural selection. It still has to do with species out in the environment competing for resources. But what Darwin suggested is that as species populated an area, then different populations of the species could become separated from one another. And we usually think about this in terms of geographic separation, so that one is on one side of the river and one's on the other side of the river, or they're on opposite sides of a mountain, or there's some geographic barrier between the two so that they can no longer interbreed. Then as each faces the challenges in its own environment, the biological changes that occur in each population will be different. They're both accumulating biological changes over time, but as each one addresses the challenges in its own environment, then the biological changes you see occurring in one population will not be the same as those you see in the other population. And so Darwin thought that what would happen over time is speciation. That is, as each population is faced with the challenges in its own environment, different biological changes will accumulate in each population. And then after a time, enough biological change would have occurred that they would be separate species. That is, even if they came back together, they wouldn't be able to reproduce with one another. So his conclusion was that closely related species share a common ancestor. So you had two species that originated in one common ancestor. The populations of the species became separated. Different biological changes accumulated in each population, resulting in, over time, the development of different species. And this is what upset people more so than natural selection, the thought that similar species could share a common ancestor. In developing the theory of natural selection and the theory of common descent, Darwin had proposed something that was simple in many ways, and yet so elegantly could explain how speciation could occur, how we could have these fossil species and descendant species, and how we could have such a great variety of different types of species. But just like every scientist, he's building on the information that's available. He didn't have all of the answers. For example, we can think of a couple of problems that he couldn't help but overlook because of the state of knowledge at the time. The first problem is with his driving force. You recall that he thought the competition for resources, the struggle for existence, is what pushed all of this along. But in looking at nature, certainly we can see that happening, but we can see other factors coming into play as well that he didn't consider. For example, we can look at the peppered moths in England. There are two variants that occur naturally, a light-colored moth and a dark-colored moth. In the original natural environment, the sides of the trees are very light-colored, and so the lighter-colored moths blend in better. They're better camouflaged, and so presumably the birds would choose the darker moths that stand out better. And what you'd expect to see in that environment is a larger number of light-colored moths than you do dark-colored moths. And in fact, that was the case. Now, historically, with the coming of industrialization, what happened was the pollutants built up on the side of the trees became darker. And in that environment, you'd expect the darker moths to have the survival advantage. You'd expect to see in a population more darker moths than light-colored moths, as the lighter-colored moths could be seen better by the birds and be eaten preferentially compared to the darker-colored moths. And in fact, that's what was seen in those peppered moth populations. In this environment, with the darker-colored trees, the darker-colored moths survived in higher numbers than the lighter-colored moths, which meant that they passed their traits down in higher numbers than the lighter-colored moths did. They were surviving and reproducing preferentially to the lighter-colored moths. Later, with the passage of anti-pollution laws, we began to see the environment recovering, going back to its original state. And in that environment, we would expect the lighter-colored moths to have the survival advantage. And we would expect to see the numbers of the lighter-colored moths in the populations to increase. And in fact, that is what we saw happening, so that there were larger numbers of lighter-colored moths than there were darker-colored moths. So while this is natural selection in action, that is, the ones that are able to survive and reproduce, is dependent on the environment at the time. It's not a competition for resources. They're not struggling for existence. They're not trying to be light-colored or dark-colored. They either are or they're not. So it is natural selection. Natural selection still holds, but it's not that driving force of the competition for resources. Another problem that Darwin had was his understanding of biological inheritance. He knew that the offspring tended to resemble the parents. He knew that these traits were passed down, but he didn't understand how that worked. The prevailing theory of biological inheritance at the time was called pangenesis. Pangenesis was a blending theory of inheritance. They didn't know about genes, but it was believed that parents passed on particles for a given trait to their offspring. If the offspring looked more like one parent than the other for a particular trait, then it was believed that that parent had contributed more particles for that trait than the other parent had. For example, if you look at my son, he has my nose. There's no doubt about it. And so under the theory of pangenesis, what they would have said was that I had given him more particles for the shape of the nose than his mother did. And his lips are his mother's. There's no doubt about that. And so under pangenesis, they would have said that his mother had given him more particles for the shape of the lips than I did. So he didn't have all the answers. No scientist ever does. But he did propose a theory that was going to rock the world. Now Darwin knew the potential of that, and so he put off publishing for a long time. He stressed out about it so much that he made himself ill. He was practically bedridden at times. But finally, in 1859, he published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And so what would you think would happen? Is this something that just a few isolated intellectuals read? Well, actually, that's not the case. It was an instant bestseller. It sold out on the first day. People were reading it on the train to and from work. And not surprisingly, a debate erupted. Some people didn't like his ideas. Some people still don't. But what about from a scientific perspective? Well, the things that we've discovered since then have continued to support his basic theories. We've had to refine it here and there. Not everything was perfect, but that's true of any scientific theory. And when I was in England and I looked at this 10-pound note with Darwin's portrait on it, it occurred to me that I had to end this lecture with a really bad joke. Because from a scientific perspective, yep, you guessed it, he was right on the money. Sorry about that. Next time in Anthropology 1510, we'll be talking about a man who was working on biological inheritance and trying to figure out how it worked. At the same time, this uproar about Darwin's work was taking place. From there, we'll go into a discussion of our modern understanding of genetics and how all of that ties into the theory of evolution. So I'll see you next time.